But first, what I'm about to say is probably not going to make me many friends, but why break the habits of a lifetime? Back in April or May, when JobKeeper and JobSeeker and all of that was introduced, I did not share the glowing enthusiasm with which so many greeted the announcement of a $130 billion stimulus package, a spending package that dwarfed anything Australians had ever seen or paid for before. Yes, of course, I recognise that the federal government's actions in closing our borders automatically meant that jobs lost because of that action would require some form of compensation or assistance, clearly. I also praised Josh Frydenberg for the philosophy of structuring the package to help employers retain staff they were being forced to lay off. So far, okay. But through a sense of urgency and expediency, another word might be panic, the scheme was structured in such a blunt and all-encompassing way that Rorts were not only inevitable, but indeed incentivised. There is simply no justification for a taxpayer-funded scheme that pays people more money than the job they lost, or indeed, which is so generous and open-ended that it encourages many people to simply shirk any available work and to hop onto the scheme, which many have done. Two things stand out. Firstly, ours was apparently the most generous COVID compensation package in the world. Looks like we really are the lucky country. Secondly, it was inevitable that the left, rather than appreciating the generosity of the taxpayer-funded scheme, would simply lock it in as the new normal and demand that it become a permanent feature of our economic landscape. As with any kowtowing to the left, which the scheme clearly was, all it does is permanently shift the centre ground of the debate further and further to the left. Predictably, now the argument from lovey economists is about why it is wrong to ramp the scheme down or to end it, rather than why it was wrong to bring it in so generously in the first place. Now, don't get me wrong, a wealthy country such as ours should always do its utmost to help people in times of misfortune, particularly when government itself is to blame for the destruction of a business or the loss of a job. The safety net is a great achievement of modern Western democracies, and yes, much of the fabric and the strength of those safety nets, but by no means all, is as a result of Labor governments and the left's struggles and victories in the past. But we should also learn from the failed experiments of the past as much as the successful ones. Warren Dean, the Indigenous spokesperson and leader, is a man whose business creation and working class credentials are second to none. Warren was one of the very first to spot the socio-economic and cultural threats and risks posed by such a generous scheme as JobKeeper. Way back in August, Warren Dean wrote in The Spectator Australia about his parents' generation and the period in the 1960s and 1970s when there was a mass transition of Indigenous Australians from work to welfare. He wrote, "Most never returned to work, nor were ever expected to. A cycle of intergenerational welfare dependency began. People lost all sense of self-sufficiency and personal responsibility, leading to the widespread family breakdown and community dysfunction we see in many Indigenous communities today," wrote Warren Dean. It was a perfect storm. Jobs disappeared en masse and government stepped into the breach with support. Aboriginal elders coined the term sit-down money. Now, any discussion these days about the generosity of our welfare schemes, as I said, doesn't make you any friends. When Josh Frydenberg back in July tried to educate the public, as he should do, as is his job, about the economics and the lessons from, for example, the Thatcher and Reagan era, he was savaged by the left-wing media. No surprise there, but as far as I'm concerned, with the sole exception of this program, Outsiders, none of the so-called conservative or centre-right media praised Josh Frydenberg for that or offered their support.
You did say, when it comes to economic reform the other day, that you'll be taking inspiration from Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Really?
Well, they dealt very successfully with the challenges that they faced. Thatcher and Reagan are figures of hate for the left because they were so successful. One got 2 terms, which was the maximum you can get in the United States. Margaret Thatcher got 11.5 years in office.
Guiding light here.
Well, you take inspiration from lots of different sources. I also take it from Howard and Costello. Right. But, I mean, the reality is that Thatcher and Reagan cut red tape, they cut taxes, and they delivered stronger economies.
So let me say it again. Well done, Josh Frydenberg. But worse, what's really bad? Neither the Prime Minister, as far as I can recall, or any of his senior colleagues publicly came out to support the Treasurer in that discussion. Conservatives and Liberals simply hung him out to dry. Shame on the lot of you. Instead, we now have a situation where the government, which introduced a generous support scheme, now gets demonised and punished as it tries to withdraw it. But that's what happens when governments and prime ministers and our schools and universities all stubbornly refuse to educate people about how and why our economy has been so successful in the past, the philosophy of the work ethic and the dangers of excessive welfare, and instead offers up an endless diet of quasi-socialist feel-good payments and bribes. But here's the real obscenity. Victoria is one of our smallest states. Only Tasmania and the ACT are smaller. In other words, unlike some of the other bigger states, you can actually get around Victoria pretty easily. Unless, of course, the lunatic who is running the show has locked you all in your homes, but that's a different story. It's just over 5 hours from Melbourne to Mildura. Back in September, it was reported, and last time I checked, it's still the case, in Victoria, more and more people were on JobKeeper than the rest of the nation combined. Now, that may have changed recently, but that's the point. Back then it was. Obviously, the harsher the lockdown, the more economic damage and the greater the job losses. So apart from the 800 deaths caused by the Andrews government's bungled hotel quarantine operations, the one where the fateful and deadly decision was not actually made by any individual but just materialised out of thin air, not only did it cost all those lives, but it also cost the rest of the Australian economy a fortune, the taxpayers, in JobKeeper payments. So you would think perhaps the Andrews government, when it's not patting itself on the back for the great job they've all done in stopping the virus, might have even just a teensy moment of self-awareness. Alas, that would be way too much to hope for. Yesterday, I read this story in The Guardian with a mixture of stunned disbelief and dismay for the future of our country. Victoria and Tasmania have struck a deal to bring 1,500 seasonal farm workers to Australia from the Pacific Islands. The Victorian government and taxpayers and agricultural industry bodies will share the cost of quarantining the workers in Tasmania and will then fly them to the mainland where their isolation ends and head them off to the farm. This arrangement isn't a silver bullet in addressing this season's challenges, says Dan Andrews, but it will ease some of the pressure being felt by farmers. The generations of brave and tireless Australians who built this nation, headed out into the bush to tame the land, built the bridges and roads and dams and cities, marched off to war to protect our freedoms, grew the crops and picked the fruit, must stare down from above and shake their weary heads in bewilderment. How, they must ask themselves, did this nation they left us become so self-indulgent, so lazy, so pampered and so spoiled that we can't even pick fruit? Our job here on Outsiders is to join the dots, often on quite complex and complicated political stories. We happily do it every week. But this week I'll let you join the dots. Clue 1, massive JobKeeper payments because so many Victorians are out of work. 2, once a welfare mentality sets in, it's very hard to shake it. 3, Victoria is our second smallest state, so it's pretty easy to get from one end to the other. 4, the Andrews government is paying to fly in thousands of fruit pickers so that they can go and pick fruit on Victorian farms. And here's a 5th clue, in case those young Australians on JobKeeper out there are struggling to keep up.
You know, a gold record probably is one of the nicest things that can ever happen to an artist. These fellows can be rightly proud. It's their first gold record for their first record. The award-winning Get a Job by the Silhouette.